Hi, everyone, and welcome to our first virtual event since 2021. I'm Andrea Grossman, the founder of Writer's Block, now in our 28th season. I wish all of you a healthy and happy new year. Hannah Rothschild is in New York, and Simon Sebag Montefiore is in London. Many of you are in places far from LA where Writer's Block is based, so I'm so delighted that you're joining us. Now for today, Hannah Rothschild is a philanthropist, a scholar, a biographer, and such a terrific novelist. As part of the global Rothschild family, she knows what titles and peerage in British society offer and what they don't. In her new novel, High Times, Hannah has delicious fun creating eccentric oddballs of the ruling class, aristocrats who have sprawling castles, fabulous estates, enormous egos, and centuries of historic entitlement. For the aristocratic Trelawney family here, the bills are as endless as the castle's hallways, the debts as overwhelming as the beauty and magnificence of the art within those crumbling walls. So what can be done to bring in a little cash to pay for those basic groceries, hot water, and that leaky roof repair? Hannah's send-up of this noble family is gleeful as its members plunge into reality TV escapades, delusional escapism, desperate social interaction, and more. Dignity seems to have jumped right off that sieve of a roof. The story of this history-steeped family wouldn't be complete without a most vulgar and hideous billionaire arriviste whose plans for the beloved ancestral castle threaten all of them. And he is American, so that makes it even more fun. This is a love story to art, to preservation, and to the joy of a most justified revenge. Remember, revenge can be sweet, and cybercrime here proves to have an upside. Simon Sebag Montefiore knows his way around art and history himself. He's a biographer and historian, and certainly one of my favorites in both genres. His new book, The World, A Family History, is just thrilling and fabulous. And you didn't hear me groan when I lifted this book up because it's so heavy and fabulous. The Rothschild family turns up among some of the families he discusses in this book, The World. Although I can't find Trelawney in the index of The World, I'm pretty certain I came across it somewhere in here. I want you to tell me if I'm right, Simon. I forgot to ask you. You'll have questions for Hannah and Simon, so email them to reservations@writersblockpresents.com. That's reservations@writersblock.presents.com. Thanks so much for joining us. And now I'm handing this off to Simon and to Hannah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Hannah, lovely to see you. This is so fun that we are now going fully transatlantic on this conversation. Transcontinental, transatlantic. Thank you so much for doing this. And I've got lots of things to ask you about the book, about your past books, about your future books, about your life. But let's just start with where we are at the moment. High Time. It's a sequel, but it completely stands on its own as well. Just give us a quick sort of description of this book, and then we can talk. You don't need to have read the House of Trelawney in order to enjoy this, but it helps.
Thank you. It's brilliant seeing you. I wish it was in the flesh, but anyway, this is second best, Simon. And
no, we'll do it next time in person.
Let's do it next time in person, exactly. And before then, we may have to practice, eating or something else. But anyway, it's lovely to see you, even across the Atlantic. So, High Time is a satirical novel, and it's set against the backdrop of high finance and low morals. I set it in 2016, and you're absolutely right that it revisits a family called the Trelawneys, who appeared first in House of Trelawney. And I think, like you, and we can talk about this later, I'm riveted by families. I can't get enough families. So the thought of saying goodbye to the Trelawneys forever was too much. So I thought I'd bring them back. And the book starts with the heroine, Aisha, who's 25. She's very beautiful. She's pampered. And she's the wife of a stratospherically successful American short seller called Sir Tomlinson Sleet. And she thinks that her life is set. She thinks, she loves art history. They have a little girl, they have a castle. I mean, all this stuff. And she's kind of looking forward to, to getting older and in terrific luxury. But overnight and unexpectedly, the trappings and the edifices of her world collapse. And she realizes that she's become just another one of her husband's dumpable assets. So in other words, he's had enough. He's had enough. And what he does, and people of that ilk do, is when they've had enough, quite often it's just done by WhatsApp if you're lucky, or you might get an attorney or a lawyer come around to see you. In her case, actually, she's slightly ahead of him. She finds out a fraction before he's told her, and that gives her the opportunity actually to try and either reverse the situation or to make her own situation better. So what does she want to do? She wants basically to salvage some self-respect. She wants to make sure she has custody of her daughter or their daughter. And to an extent, she wants revenge, because why should he get away with this? The problem for her is that her only real skill is an MA in art history. And, much as we love art and much as we know about art history, it's not necessarily going to get you out of every single hole. And her biggest ally is an 87-year-old dowager countess who's really only good at winning kind of flower shows and dog competitions. So this is really all she's got. So Aisha suddenly knows that the rug is about to be pulled out. She's got very little kind of ammunition on her side. And so really the book is about, what would you do? What would any of us do if we suddenly found out we went to bed and we woke up the next morning with absolutely nothing? What do you do next? And really the story is trying to follow her through this journey.
Hannah, have you known people in that situation?
Have I known, or do we know?
Have you known people in a situation like this in real life? Because it's so well. Because I asked, and let me tell you why I asked that question. Why you're thinking of the right answer? Because it's so well rendered with such a mixture of worldly. I think this is the genius of your books. Is the marriage of worldliness, playfulness, knowledge of the taste of the fruit of the tree of good and evil, all mixed together, and with a kind of wit, but also a sense that life is a casino, and that you never know what's going to happen. And these two books that go together, but can be read separately, are celebrations of life. They're indictments of life, their journeys, their plays, their entertainments. So you have of course we know you have knowledge of the great world, but do you have knowledge of people losing everything on the spot, as happens to Aisha?
It's a good question. Yeah, no, I do know people who've woken up and have been absolutely treated like, as I said, a dumpable asset. On the whole, they've had an advantage though, in that they've been able, they've been legally married, or they've had a prenup or whatever else. So they have been able to go and find some kind of sanctity or some help, through the legal system. So on the whole, yes, I mean, there's been an incredible loss of face. There's been an incredible loss of, status, etc., but they have been backed up by the law. So then I think, and then truthfully, I thought, well, what would I do? What would Hannah do? Who, I've had such a privileged and lucky upbringing. I've been so incredibly lucky, and I've had a kind of parachute of coming from a family. And sometimes I think, if there was a Madoff situation, or if there was a massive world crash, what would I be qualified for? Sometimes I think I just have to be a dog walker, because I'm not sure if I'm really going to be that good at.
Well, there's a lot of money to be made in dog walking.
Well, I think maybe a lot. There would be, and I think it might be less stressful than doing some other jobs I have thought about. So a lot of this is imagination, but no, I think it is. You do read, and I do know people who've lost everything overnight. I mean, in that Madoff situation I referred to, I think you and I probably have mutual friends where they went to bed one night and the next morning, there is absolutely nothing. What was that series called? Ozark. Yeah.
Yeah, I love Ozark. But that's why I like these situations, because everyone thinks everything's going to last forever. And then worlds can change, cities can fall, markets can fall. But let me ask you a writer's question, because you've got the tone just right in this. How do you, but you've got a balance between serious machinations. You've got to understand quite a lot about the art world and finance and Bitcoin, which we'll come to in a minute. But also, this is immensely playful and witty, and people have wonderful names like Sleet, the Tomlinson Sleet, and so on. How, writer's question, how do you get the balance right? How did you balance these two things?
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful question, and it's one that, of course, you will know both through your historical novels and through other work, which is that you've got to. It's very, very easy, I think, well, there are two things. It's very easy to over-explain, and you can drown your readers in too much extrapolation and explanation, and completely lose sight of the plot. On the other hand, if you're talking about reasonably complicated subjects such as cryptocurrency or short selling, you do need to actually assume that not everybody knows about that. And also the mechanics of my plot very much are turned on some deals. So if people don't understand the mechanics of how that might work, then the plot would make no sense at all. So what I did, and what I've done in the past, is to do an enormous amount of research so that I can understand it. So I feel that I've literally kind of ingested what it's about, then write it out. And then as a writer, I think one of the things we do, and I'd love to know what you do, is you put down almost everything you know, and then you've just got to start taking stuff away, stripping. And the really delicate bit is how you want really to strip away as much as you possibly can, because you want to wear your research as lightly as possible. But there is a moment, isn't there, when you can go too far one way or the other. And I think that's where you and I are lucky enough to have editors. So the editors will come in and say, actually, I don't quite get that, or actually, you bored me to tears in that paragraph. I don't know, how do you, love to know how you do it. For example,
well, Philip Kerr, who wrote the Bernie Gunther thrillers, who I knew who died, but who was brilliant. He always said that with historical novels or technical novels, you only need to know 40% more than the reader. But with this Bitcoin, let's move on to the Bitcoin bit of this and the sort of digital bit of it, because that's fascinating.
Sure.
And you have to master that. You have to know. So someone like the Queen of Coin, the Queen of Coin, one of your villainesses, without giving anything away. Yeah. She's an extravagant character, but actually there are several sort of Queens of Coin on the run as we speak around the world, aren't there? So she's based on several real people, isn't she? They're not all Albanian, but some are Chinese, some are Ukrainian, some are Russian or Ukrainian, I think. So how did you master Bitcoin? And can you explain to those what they need to know about it to understand both the novel and the world that we're living in?
Yeah, okay. So starting with the last question first. Bitcoin basically it's a form of currency. And on the whole, it's really pegged, instead of being pegged to a country or to a gold standard, it's really pegged to how much you believe in it. Most Bitcoins are Ponzi schemes, basically. And somebody says, right, buy a Bitcoin, and if somebody else wants to pay more than you bought it for, it's going to be worth more. But basically, that's really as sophisticated as it is. There are some, like Bitcoin itself, which is self-regulated in that you have the people who own it actually keep a tally of how many there are. So there's a finite amount of Bitcoins in circulation. But it's one of the easiest things to manipulate. And one of the inspirations, and you're absolutely right, there were 4 or 5 characters who inspired this woman who I invented, who's an Albanian called Dr. Zamora Lala. And one of the people who inspired her was a lady called Rusha Ignatova, who's actually Bulgarian, who features in a fantastically good BBC podcast. So if any of you've got 12 hours to spare, it's gripping. It's not boring at all. And she's called The Missing Crypto Queen or something. And she's an example of someone who's basically jumped on the bandwagon, because we all love to get rich. Or, we all love a quick get rich scheme. Well, maybe not all of us, but it's very tempting, isn't it? If you say, if you buy this pen from me, you buy this now, and you can have 15 pens within 20 minutes, and you think, oh, okay, fine, all right, fine. And that's really, I think, people are preying on our most basic, human sensibilities, really. I don't think I hold it against anyone wanting to get wealthier or wanting to have more. I believe that's quite a human impulse.
And how did you, because you've sort of mastered some of the technical, the way this market works. When you say you did research, do you find the biggest Bitcoin genius and take them out for lunch and take notes, or have you read, or take us through some of this? Because this book has quite a lot of research behind it, as you said. How do you do that research?
So in the finance world, I sit on various boards of different companies. So, for example, investment trusts, asset management companies, etc., etc. I chair another one. So, actually, and I was brought up in a family where my dad, when we were very small, he would expect us to come to dinner, and we were expected to be able to have a conversation, say, with a Japanese businessman, and he would say, "You need to learn this, this, and this." So you'd go down to dinner age 9 and you say, "And tell me, how do you think the yen is doing?" It's obviously didn't particularly understand, but I'm quite, I've got, it's kind of in my DNA to be able to chat about finance, and you pick it up. Then when I started going on boards, serious boards, I went back to night school. So I went to night school at the age of 40 something to actually, I thought, I really can't blag this anymore. I actually need to learn. So I went back to night school, and then I found out that finance has its own language. Many things have their own language, but finance has a particularly arcane kind of language. So then, to my horror, I would be sitting in meetings and I couldn't really understand, the IRR and the EBITDA and the Series A and the B and the C and the da-da-da. And that's like, oh my God, right, you've got to go and learn the language now. So I learned that language, which is literally a language of its own. It's a discrete language that people use, I think, probably to confuse others. They certainly confused me for a time. So long before this book came onto the horizon, I had already started a process of self-education. Then Bitcoin, I guess what happened with Bitcoin is that, truthfully, I did not understand it. I just didn't get it. I didn't understand crypto. I kind of, to me, it was, as I said earlier, it felt so Emperor's New Clothes. It was so foreign. It was so inexplicable that then I decided, right, I really wanted to make it part of a book, because the book is set in 2016. And to me, one of the major issues of 2016 is crypto. So if you're writing a book set in the world of finance, you cannot ignore it. So to your point, yes, there weren't that many books on it, by the way, at that time. Very little was written about it. It was a reasonably new thing. So you're right, I did a lot of lunches and drinks and teas, and I took people out and I said, please explain, please explain, please explain. And, gradually this kind of amorphous, strange world kind of came into focus. And now, yes, I think I can understand it. And when you say, how do you know you've understood it? Truthfully, I've understood it this well. I've never bought a Bitcoin or a crypto, because I understand it well enough to know that it's quite a dangerous milieu.
Let me ask you, just completely change gear, and just ask you again a sort of writer's question, which I'm always fascinated by. One of the things your family are brilliant is, it is the great family of multitasking, among many other things, fascinating things about the Hannah Rothschild. But you do so many things. You're on boards, you're on art, you run vast art galleries, you write these wonderful novels. Can you just tell us, we'd love to know a typical day, how you fit in the writing, the finance, that you have family too. You have wonderful children, a wonderful father. How do you fit in all these things? Could you give us a sort of taste of a day that includes writing when you're writing a book?
Yeah. Well, yes. I have to. The only possible way is to treat it like an illicit love affair. So a little bit like, not obviously I've ever had an illicit love affair, let me be very clear about that. But were I to have had an illicit love affair?
Very tactfully put, Hannah.
Very tactfully put.
Very tactfully put.
Very tactfully put. So you'd have to kind of, you know, because there are a lot of other things going on. So I would have to, you know, I sneak off with the manuscript to a coffee shop, and sometimes I take it away for a weekend to a hotel, and sometimes I'll tell my office that actually, you know, I'm in that, you know, X and Y and Z meeting, but actually I'm in the London Library doing this, that, and the other. Because I think for me, that's really, and it's not just because I'm busy. I mean, you're busy, lots of us are busy, but it's also because I want to retain the kind of excitement of writing. And I think that when it becomes a job, and which is not to say that I wouldn't often think, God, if only it was a job, my main job, but or my only job, I should say. I think that because I'm writing satire and humor, I think for me it's very helpful to keep it kind of in this rather illicit sphere. And personally, COVID and that whole lockdown was an absolute nightmare. I couldn't write a word because I missed, you know, there was nothing illicit, it was just fear, wasn't it? It was fear and boredom, you know, and going between the fridge and the telly.
Do you write notes all the time when you're writing, just to sort of think? I mean, how do you plan? Do you plot the whole thing beforehand, or do you? Because there are so many twists. Do you add twists all the time, or do you sort of basically know where you're going?
No, I don't. I have a kind of, I kind of know where I'm going to end up roughly, but the journey along, and I don't think this is a very efficient way of writing. Actually, the journey along tends to be. It tends to evolve during the process, which is, as I said, a very, very inefficient way of doing it. Do you have a plan? Do you map it out carefully?
For my fiction, yeah, no, not in detail. I think it's nice to when the characters gain their own sort of lives and their own integrity. It's fun to let them suddenly decide something for themselves. Don't you think?
Yeah,
I'm sure you have examples of that in here.
It's interesting, if you're writing historical fiction, which, you know, you have and, you know, will hopefully keep doing, are you not bound by dates, or do you find that actually you can still kind of riff?
I think it's like a cathedral, like the pillars of a cathedral. You can't change the pillars of the cathedral, like the war starts in 1939 or Kennedy's assassinated in 1960.
Yeah.
But otherwise, you could among the, you know, within the cathedral or outside the cathedral, a lot can happen around those huge pillars. So that's my rule, writing these things. But let me just go.
Yeah, go.
Let me get back. I've got quite a lot to ask you, Hannah. So I love bringing me into this, but
I know I'm trying to keep bringing you in, but you keep deflecting.
I know, but
anyway,
so sweet,
I'll keep trying.
I know, but actually, there's a lot to get through. And I just want to ask you a few things. And there's also,
I'll behave.
People dying to hear things about you because you're fascinating in so many directions. So let me just ask you another thing. I mean, you've also been in the art world, and the art world, like the Bitcoin world, I suppose, reveals a lot. I mean, all three of your novels are about the art world in some way or other, or have huge art threads of plot. And you know the art world very well, partly through your family, partly through your own achievements and your own life, being head of the National Gallery and all of that. The art gallery is also very like a stock market, isn't it? I mean, obviously there are sort of brand names in it that everyone thinks is a genius and will pay 100 million for a Picasso. But most people don't really know why a Picasso is better than an unknown artist of exactly the same time. And then you've got contemporary art, where a lot of it is brilliant and a lot of it is rubbish. And most people don't know the difference, but they know that it has a value. So that's also a great way of looking at society, isn't it? Tell us why the art world always features so largely in your three novels, I mean.
So I absolutely. I mean, listen, I'm obsessed by the art world. I mean, I studied art at university as one of my courses. I, worked in the art world in different ways. As you say, I used to chair the National Gallery. I collect art. I have quite a lot of friends who are artists, etc., etc. So I find it very, very difficult to escape from it, nor do I want to, because, as you eloquently said, it encompasses so many different ideas and veins, and it's etc. So the wonderful thing, and I think one of the, and it's a bit like a cryptocurrency, the thing about any painting, it doesn't matter unless it's painted on a wall, which is slightly different, but any painting is basically a piece of canvas and some oils. And their values, therefore, are exactly the same, and almost nothing. Because, any of us could go out and get some canvas and put some oils on it, etc., etc. And they're, they're worthless. They might be worth what the canvas, maybe a few pounds, whatever, nothing more than that. So then, as you absolutely say, what makes a Picasso worth 100 million and make, something by John Brown worth a fiver? What is that? And the thing that I completely love about art is that art really, the price of a work of art is how much you want it. It's absolutely the only thing. It's about desire.
So
do I really, really?
Bitcoin. It's the same.
It's exactly
Bitcoin,
that. It's exactly the same. It's an intangible price of desire. And now art is more interesting, in my opinion, than Bitcoin. I mean, a hell of a lot more interesting, partly because you've got something beautiful to look at. And then other values, will make it, other values, not literal financial values, will make it appreciate. So, for example, if that Picasso was the first painting that he ever did of his wife Jacqueline, and if he gave it to her for her birthday, and if he scrawled on the back of it, "To Jacqueline, the greatest love of my life, from your little Pico," or something, that immediately makes that painting more valuable. Or if you had a Titian and you could trace that Titian painting, from the court of Charles V, the whole way through history to King Charles III, for example. Let's suppose King Charles decides to sell one of his Titians. So that gives it an additional value because of who's looked at it and who's owned it. And then, of course, you have other values. So fashion. So a painting might, there's a painter who I particularly love called Piero della Francesca, but for 400 years, you couldn't give his work away because he was totally out of fashion. And then suddenly he came roaring back into fashion, in the early 20th century, and suddenly everybody wanted one. So there are these additional things which make it, I think, more interesting than crypto, because as yet, crypto doesn't have those additional kind of, markets.
But isn't the thing that's perfect for you and novelists and historians, for that matter, is that there's mystery, there's crime. You can fake pictures, you can steal pictures, and pictures have mystery, and they're often lost. As you were references, the provenance is often mysterious. They're often lost or stolen. So they're perfect. Isn't art the perfect novelist's world to write in it? As you've shown with 3 novels now.
Well, actually, and the next one's also going to go into the art world in a slightly different way. But no, it is the perfect. It's got everything. It's, as you say, it's got beauty, it's got mystery, it's got intrigue, it's got, it's literally got everything. And because they're quite portable, they can go all over the world. You can quite quickly. I mean, there was one painting I wrote about in my first book, The Improbability of Love, which had been on a donkey. Napoleon had put it on the back of a donkey and sent it back to Paris. And actually, there were many paintings which were strapped to the backs of donkeys and sent off to Paris. So you've got all sorts of stuff going on. No, I absolutely love writing about art for all those reasons.
So what's, I was going to ask you this at the end, but since you've mentioned it. So is this another House of Trelawney novel?
What, the next one?
Clue? Yeah. Can you give us a clue?
No,
I'm actually now. What is it
I'm having a slight break from the Trelawneys. I think I was a super saturated Trelawney solution, but for another reason, which I'll come back to in a minute. Now I am actually going to be writing something about Piero della Francesca, and it involves a mystery around one of the paintings and how it was nearly destroyed and who rescued it, etc., etc. So I won't say much more than that, but it's good. It's another good art story. It's a good. I hope it's going to be a thriller. I hope so.
Oh, good.
So I hope, but it's no. I tell you what I was going to say actually was the thing I love about the Trelawneys is that. So the first one was set in the financial crash of 2008-9, and then this one is set in 16 with, Brexit, the rise of Trump, crypto, etc., etc. But I have found it, and I'd be interested. I know I'm not allowed to ask you questions, but I would be interested in the nearness of time and writing about things where it's very close to you. And writing about 2016 in like 2019, 2021, which is roughly when I was writing or trying to write it, I found really hard because the perspective on time, it was so recent that I couldn't really get far enough away to understand. I mean, you're obviously writing, maybe I'm not allowed, you can tell me I'm not allowed to talk to you, but I would love to know, whether, I know you've written recently, for example, about Putin, etc., etc. But do you find, are you always looking at it through the lens of history when you're writing about something contemporary? Are you more comfortable writing about something further away?
Well, that's such a good question. I mean, I think you've dealt with it, your 2016 very well, but I think you can with fiction. I really hate this fashion. I don't know if you agree that on ITV they're always doing these dramas based on sort of Boris Johnson or something, literally sort of 6 months after or some sort of scandal, 6 months after it happened. And I always think that they never, for some reason, they don't really work. I think. Usually.
No, you're right.
And that is partly because of the perspective. Not to speak the legal read properly means that no one can actually put anything outrageous.
Yeah.
But I in the world, I do take it up to the invasion of Ukraine. And the more research, it was really fun. For me, it was really fun bringing history right up to the present, because I wouldn't normally do that. But I think there is a danger that you have to overcome the prejudices and the sort of fog of the present, and that is a real challenge, isn't it? Because so often you sort of step back, you step back, and you suddenly realize that something you thought everyone was talking about only a year ago is complete nonsense. I mean, look at the internet, look at Twitter, or X as it is now. I mean, people are literally in a frenzy of hatred for something or somebody, literally a week ago. A week later, they've all forgotten about it and are on to something else, as if it never happened. So I think one's got to be very careful of the present and always confront.
But is it
wisdom.
When, as you say, when in the world, when you brought it up to the present day, was it, you said it was fun to write about the present day, but was it, as a historian, more interesting to write about the past and see the arc of time? Do you see what I mean? Why did you, the arc of time must be so fascinating when you have as much knowledge as you have.
Yeah, but it's a lot of fun when you've got the sort of, when you're writing about so many hundreds of years, and the great thing about history, historians are actually very bad prophets. And historians are always expected to predict the future. And if you name any historian, they've always got everything completely wrong. So it's a very dangerous thing. But let me go back. I want to ask you something now.
Yeah, sure.
So there was something you mentioned really interesting earlier that I think I can't resist going back to. I was going to ask you about your family later, but since you brought it up,
that's fine.
I think you're the 8th generation of the Rothschilds since Frankfurt, aren't you? And the one thing about your family that's quite extraordinary is the fact that you've always stayed ahead of the game. And you mentioned that story earlier about your father when you were a child, inviting you to the dinner table, and there'd be some potentate there, and you were expected to be able to at least talk to them a bit. And about something that they knew about, even when you were little. Do you think, and your father is a fabulous person who I know quite well and admire. And do you think that spirit is part of the reason why the Rothschilds have always stayed ahead of the game, are still in the game? Or if not that, what is it? What is that special quality that the Rothschilds have?
It's a great question, and actually one that I must admit, I have thought about a lot. I mean, you also know, knowing our family, and our families have been very intertwined over the years, that it's not always a given. I mean, I was thinking about my great uncle Walter the other day, who actually didn't do an awful lot more than train some zebras to pull a carriage, and then drove the carriage pulled by zebras up to meet the Queen. And I think that if you asked him what he was most proud of, he'd have said that, quite honestly.
Yeah.
And then, you know, so there are kind of, I don't know whether you call them aberrations or maybe that's too pejorative, but you know, there are exceptions perhaps.
Well, it's full of eccentrics. The family is full of eccentrics, for sure.
Oh, it's absolutely nutters, absolutely nutters.
And you've written about Jazz Baroness, for example, who is one of, I think it was your first book. It's brilliant, and that's a history.
That's right.
That's a biography, and that's a brilliant book. So she's just one example of a fact that, you know, your family. I think we can say that she was an unusual person.
I think she was very unusual.
So
I think
what
the
about,
thing that what is it then? Yeah, so I think one of the things is which my dad's always impressed upon me. He said two things. He's always said, you've got to put your hat in the ring. So in other words, you know, you got to try. And then you say, well, why? And he said, because it's not. He said, you've got so many advantages that it's not your fault that you were born with these advantages, but it's your responsibility to make the most of them. And I think that kind of maxim in life, if you like, which is that if you are lucky enough, as I am, to have been, you know, born and brought up with so many advantages, you just got to get out there. You've got to try and get out there. And I think that is what many members of my family have done. And there is a pressure to be excellent. I'm not going to, definitely, there's quite a lot of pressure to, you know, if you're going to do something, you've got to do it well. And that's tough. I mean, I'm not going to pretend it's not difficult. It is tough. There's quite a lot of responsibility. There's quite a lot of pressure to make the most of things. And not everyone comes through that. I mean, I think, funnily enough, I think it was particularly difficult for the male Rothschilds because there was much more pressure on them to succeed in business, for example, where actually not all of them, like my great uncle Walter, was suitable. You know, he was not ever going to cut out to be a businessman. So I think it was very, very difficult for the young Rothschild males actually to live up to the expectations of previous generations.
Is that still true, do you think? Is that still true, do you think?
Yeah. Well, I think it's probably now, I think there's pressure on females and males actually. So I think it's not, I think it's less acute. The sexes, you know, kind of divide is, you know, has come together more. But yes, there is, you know, you don't, if you're going to do something, you've got to do it well.
Yeah, so that's terrifying for most people.
Yeah, well, by the way, for me too. I find it terrifying. You know, now I'm older, but it's less frightening because, you know, now I think, oh, well, you know, I don't care so much about failure because, you know, I've had failures so I don't mind so much, but I was absolutely stricken by a terror of failure when I was younger.
I should just say, if anyone wants to ask any questions, email them. And the email is reservations@writersblockpresents.com. And we'll read some of them out and answer them a bit later. The female thing is just interesting, Hannah, because you know, you've been chairman of the National Gallery. You're on the board of all these companies now. You've written 3 novels and one history book biography. First of all, this is a 2-part question, but I want you to answer both parts because both are important. A, your female characters are very good. How much of you is in them? Everyone always asks everyone who writes a novel that. Very annoying question, but you have to answer it because everyone wants to know.
Fine.
And you know, which is part of it. Your female characters, and B, you know, in the Rothschild family, women were originally banned from the bank, from working in the bank, but they became more influential. Of course, women have always been influential in families. You have people like Rosita, Charlotte, all these fascinating characters from history. And how has it been being a female Rothschild?
So
the characters
the first one, Okay, shall I start with the first bit?
Yeah.
You're quite strict. I'm obviously I'm not going to try and shirk this one. So how much of the characters are part of me? What you beg and as a novelist, you beg, steal, borrow from everyone, and particularly from your own story. I think, I think anyone who pretends that their characters got nothing to do with them. I mean, well, they may be perhaps, more inventive than I am, but I mean, I absolutely plunder from my own experience all the time. I try and dress it up and not make it look quite so like me, perhaps. But I'm not the only one, and I plunder from other stories. I mean, I tell you honestly, the world, if anyone wants to look for great stories and great families and great, examples, just read Simon's book, The World. I mean, it's funny, it's a page turner, and it's got the most brilliant stories in it. I mean, I don't know whether, sometimes I wonder whether you chose them because their stories are so fantastic. So, but I promise you, I mean, what?
Of course I did. Some of them I did, but there are a lot of amazing women. I mean, to bring you back tactfully to this question,
yeah.
I mean, it's filled with. I mean, the great time that we're living in is that women can do anything, and we're very interested in female stories, and that's a good thing. That's a good obsession in the present. Yes. There are a lot of obsessions that are tedious and foolish and horrible.
Yeah,
this is a good one. And so the world is filled with great female characters in history, some of which you'd have heard of.
It is.
Great, and Cleopatra and Thatcher, and some of them you won't have heard of. But so you've answered the first part of that question, Hannah. So now to go back to you, the House of Rothschild is a very male-dominated family, traditionally, especially in the 19th century, but obviously even into the 20th and 21st. So how have you coped with suddenly, I mean, this is a very personal question, but how is it being a female Rothschild in 2023? And how have you coped in boardrooms, just being suddenly the person that you became? You described at the beginning how you did all the studies and learned the language and the vernacular. I mean, how's that been, that experience?
So, yeah, listen, I mean, it's been, I think when I first started, I felt that I was there I'm just being entirely honest with you. Yeah. I felt I was there for the wrong reasons, under false pretenses, because I felt that, the board seat should probably have been occupied by somebody who, had been at finance forever and ever, amen. And as I said, it took me some time to learn the language. It took me some time to feel kind of comfortable in that milieu. But what I came to realize, and actually, funny enough, a lot of this was through chairing other boards, like at the National Gallery, et cetera, is that companies are ecosystems. And what I can bring to a board may not be a technical financial knowledge of the exact moment that you should sell yen, to go back to that subject, or buy Bitcoin. But what I can bring, and what I do bring, I think, is something very different. So I bring a very broad knowledge. I bring a sense of propriety. I'm not saying people I'm on boards that are not proper, but I bring insight into human behavior, a lot of which I've gained through writing and thinking about writing and everything else. And, actually, we had a situation quite recently in one of these companies, which was very difficult. And it was a very, very, very difficult moment. And actually, my strengths were, I can say this now, were very, very important in that situation. And I felt, actually, you know what, I've earned my place here. And I've earned it through learning, and listening, and but also just through being, a human being and being very engaged. I'm not sure that answers your question.
That does answer. It's a very good answer. I think one should say that the House of Trelawney is nothing like the House of Rothschild. I mean, they're sort of,
it's not.
they're opposites. So no one can accuse you of using your own family in that way. But and family is fascinating. I mean, our families have been sort of in business and intermarried over centuries, and here we are now.
Yeah.
So why do you think families are so? Why have you chosen to tell certainly the last two novels through family?
Because I think that families are the most interesting constructs that we all live through. I mean, I think that, you know, whether we like or loathe our families, I happen to like mine very much these days, just for the record, you can't ever escape from them. They're absolutely, they mold you from the first thing. And they're ultimately, actually, I believe, pretty much all we have at the end of the day. You know, when you're old and in your dotage, what do you have? You have your families. And I think that you've proven, and I'm not trying to deflect from myself, but I think you have probably invented a whole new strand of history. I think that, you know, with the world, I mean, you know, it's not Marxist history, it's not economic history, it's not social history, it's not this, but now you've invented this thing called the family history. So looking at history through the arc of different families. And I don't think history will go back after that book. I think what you've done is something so extraordinary.
Oh, well, thank you. That's so sweet of you to say.
No, I really mean that. I genuinely mean that. And I was reading and pennies were dropping with each chapter. I think, oh, of course. And it's, you know, I think the same thing that must have fascinated you and, you know, you thought, I'm going to look at history through this lens. For me as a writer of novels, I thought, well, I want to explore moments in history through one family. And as you rightly say, they're not anything like my family, but they are a family that I've become quite fond of just through writing about them.
What did your family think when you started to write novels? Were they terrified that you were going to, because this is so unlike your family, I can say this, but weren't they terrified at first that you were going to end up writing a sort of pastiche Rothschild novel, which you absolutely haven't done in any of these novels?
No, they were, when I wrote The Baroness, which was the book about my great aunt, my dad, who is very, very supportive, and you know, and as you know, we're very, very close. We work very closely together on all sorts of areas. And he rang me up and he said, "I've got one question." I said, "Yes, Dad." And he goes, "Do you have to do this?" Which was like a brilliant question in a way.
Yes.
And I kind of thought about it, and I kind of said, "I think I do." And he said, "Okay." And that's the last I heard, actually. And that, when that book came out, it was quite interesting because I wrote about, you know, some of the family issues we'd had, some mental illnesses that had run.
Well, wait, just saying it, Hannah, we've got time, just say in a nutshell what the Jazz Baroness, what that story is, because it's such I love that book.
So the Jazz Baroness, I had a great aunt called Pannonica, which was a great name in itself, who was never, ever, ever mentioned. And one day I was looking at our family tree and I was suddenly saw, my father has an aunt called Pannonica, has never been mentioned. What the hell? So I know I said to him, you know, "Oh, well, who is she?" And then he kind of said, "Well, you know, she lives in America. She ran away to find a man called Thelonious Monk in the 1950s. Charlie Parker died in her arms. And really, that's all I know about her." And that's what he said. So, of course, that was like, whoa, red rag to a bull. Off I went. And I went to New York. This was in the early 80s. So it wasn't like today when there's endless flights. You know, it was kind of quite a big deal. And I looked her up in the telephone directory, and there she was, Baroness Pannonica de Königswater. So I rang her up and I said, "Hi, I'm your great niece." And there was this incredible silence. My family's obviously very good at silences. And then she goes, "Wild." So, which is not how you expect your 70-year-old great aunt to behave. Long story short, she said, "Right, meet me downtown." And I said, "Well, how do I know where to find it?" And she said, "Just look out for the Bentley." And then she hung up. So I had the street name and the cross street, and I went down there, and indeed there was a Bentley, and the Bentley's lights were on and it was shining towards the door. If this sounds very Hollywood, it really was like this. And so I could see there was a door, and I knocked on it, and there she was sitting near to the stage, and she was with kind of incredible long hair and a cigarette, you know, and a very, very long filter. And of course, you know, I was 20-something. I mean, I was absolutely agog, you know. And I got to know her a bit. And indeed, my father was right. You know, Charlie Parker had died in her apartment. She used her inheritance to support an entire generation of musicians, which included Thelonious Monk and Art Blakey and, you know, Sonny Rollins, you name the whole lot of it. And her life, she lived in Weehawken, just over from Manhattan. And every single night she drove her convertible Bentley from Weehawken into Manhattan to listen to jazz. And she did that until she died in the 80s. So she was a kind of to die for subject, if you want, you know.
Perfect. It's an amazing story. I love that book. So I think we have to take some sort of questions. We're running out of time a bit, but I want to ask you a sort of, again, a writer's question. Who are the novelists, both literary and satirical, that you love? Who do you read? Who do you base yourself on? Who do you read for inspiration? Who do you read for pleasure? What do you read?
Well, obviously I read Simon Sebag, Montefiore.
Yeah. Well, that's very good of you too. But I'm talking
with
sort of
great
fiction.
pleasure in my time.
I'm quite. Trollope? Do you read?
Trollope, of course. If you're trying to write like I write, you know, Trollope is the absolute acme, isn't it? Of you know, those and Dickens, obviously, and actually the British, of course, are incredibly good at these kind of very long-standing family sagas, whether it's Dickens or Trollope. I mean, those would have to be the kind of, you know, the highest level one could aspire to of this kind of satire. And they're very funny, as you know. I mean, they're extremely funny. And so when I was thinking about, you know, what to name the baddie in this book, he's called Sir Tomlinson Sleet, you know, and actually that's, of course, inspired by many Dickens, many Dickensian characters. And Trollope, there's nobody better, I think, for pillorying, I mean, literally pillorying society, including, incidentally, you know, my forebears. He was, you know, he was kind of pretty anti-Semitic, and but I think in fairness, he was as anti-Semitic as he was anti quite a lot of other things. So that it was, I think his vicious tongue was fairly even-handed, if you like. I don't think it was. So I think I have to try and give that caveat. I'm not quite sure whether he'd be publishable now in some ways. I mean, I think.
No, but Zola and Balzac are also. You must dip into those, because they also are very good on these kind of. Because Sleet is in a great tradition of monstrous businessmen, isn't he?
Yes, and of course the way we live now, in Augustus Melmotte, you know, which is Trollope's.
Melmotte is another, yeah.
Melmotte was a Jewish businessman, and actually Trollope's language, which I'm not even going to repeat it online because it's so repulsive. And but you know, when I reread it a couple of years ago, and I was actually horrified by his language. I could not believe the kind of what he called people, and the kind of vile kind of anti-Semitic rants he went into. And interesting enough, and I don't know if you've had this experience, but of course I'd read Trollope when I was much, much younger, and I was, are we more sensitive now? But I don't remember being so shocked 30 years ago as I was 3 years ago. You know what I mean?
Well, it's come back, but the reason is because we've you know, things that were taboo 70 years ago are now suddenly kind of wildly acceptable in large parts of society in different parts of the world. So we are more sensitive, but we're also more vulnerable. And, you know, we're living, and so that's one of the reasons why we're, you know, this is a terrifying time to be alive in a way, because things that we thought, battles we fought long ago are having to be refought. But that's another subject for another day, perhaps.
God, we've got to get together and do that subject as well in a different forum.
We should.
Yeah.
Andrea,
but you've done so much on that. Yeah.
Well, and you'll do that. You'll continue that in person at Writer's Block. So much more to get to with this. We have so many great questions here.
Okay, fire away.
With so little time. But I do want to say that to order books, go to chevaliersbooks@gmail.com. They have copies of Hannah's book High Time and The World. They have copies of The World, and actually some of Simon's copies are signed. Yeah. So anyway, okay. The other thing I want to say before we go any further is that I know nothing about Bitcoin. I know nothing about cryptocurrency except what I, you know, read, you know, in the papers about the thieves and, you know, hucksters. You don't need to know anything about Bitcoin or cryptocurrency to love this book. I mean, I just loved it. So, and I know nothing about Bitcoin, except I know that I'm not going near it. Okay. So the first question that was sent in was, Bitcoin brings up many questions, as does AI. In terms of get rich quick themes, how do you think AI will affect value in the art world, that you deal with, Hannah? The National Gallery art world and the Courtauld collection art world.
Okay, so I think it's a very good question, and there's lots of different ways to come at an answer. I would say that I think AI is obviously going to affect every single aspect of our life. I think there's no aspect of our life that AI will not affect in some way. So why would the art world be any different? There's obviously a whole thing. NFTs are rather like cryptocurrency, in my opinion, although they do have a market and lots of people like to buy NFTs. I would go back though to something else, which is that I think there is something about authenticity which you cannot manufacture. So, and what both crypto does to an extent and what AI does is that you are creating kind of things in cyber reality, but nothing will ever replace the sheer power and joy of standing in front of an original artwork. So for that reason, I think even though there will be many NFTs, there will be many copies, there will be many different ways of exploring collections, I would urge everybody just to go and stand in front of a really beautiful painting, even if it's for 5 minutes, and just that feeling will never be replicated, in my opinion.
Another follow-up on this question is, your discussion of art is so fascinating. Who are the gatekeepers of why some things are valued and others are not?
Well, I think that it's interesting. It's such a good question again, because in the past there were critics, who everyone would listen to. So, for example, there was a critic called David Sylvester. I remember everyone would rush out and kind of, read what David Sylvester said was good that week, or this, that, and the other, and they could change taste and they could affect it. And then there were art historians like Francis Haskell or Berenson, and then there were dealers like Duveen in the past, and now you have the contemporary dealers who give art an imprimatur. So in some respects, the gatekeepers are still the specialists, but I think we're all experts now, truthfully. We're all experts. And the most important thing, I think, is to try and believe in your own taste, and to really think, if I really like that work of art, and then that is good enough. And that is, I would always buy something I liked rather than something which I felt was popular, or something that, a critic has said X or Y, or that a particular dealer was trying to flog, So I think just buy what you love, and also trust yourself.
I think we're going to have to wrap up on this next question. In many aristocratic families where the wealth has been dissipated by one generation or another, I suppose recent generation, is that because there was no pressure to be excellent, as you put it, with your own family expectations?
I think sometimes it's that. I think sometimes it can be really bad luck, that people just bet on the wrong thing and they lose it overnight. So I don't think there's a one size fits all. So I think pressure to try and do the best that you can is obviously a good thing, but there are terrible accidents that happen to people along the way. So I don't think one can say it's necessarily an individual's fault.
Right. I mean, I've read so many really great books myself about that's why I like this question that came in, where some guy took his helicopter and crashed it through, the dome in his gorgeous, gorgeous manner, and all that. And so that would be dissipation, and that's no that's no terrible run of bad luck. That's just I guess too much alcohol. or whatever.
Well, that obviously doesn't help either.
Yeah.
Note to self: do not drink too much.
Yeah, when piloting a helicopter, right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Not such a good idea.
Okay, I think now it is the hour, and so I just want to thank both of you, and I want to say how much I enjoyed this book and the other Trelawney book. I just loved it, as well as The Improbability of Love. So chevaliersbooks@gmail.com. Tell them you want them. Hannah and Simon, I really hope to see you soon in Los Angeles, and thank you again.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
What
Thank you very much. Thank you, Simon.
Lots of love,
Thank you so
Hannah.
much.
See you
Bye.
All right, lots of love to you. Okay.
Bye.
Bye, Andrea. Thanks for
Bye-bye.
having me.
Thank you.
Bye.